Please like and subscribe to this podcast. And if you like what we're doing, leave us a good review or even share with somebody else. It helps us reach as many people as possible.
And I said to the head of the hospital, I said, I'm just a hopeless case. And he said, you may well be. He says, but you're not a lost cause. Hiya, I'm John.
Welcome to Bottled Up, and I'm Lou. And our subject for today is hope.
Hope, yeah. It's one of the things that people who come to a podcast like this are really looking for. They're looking for hope. They're looking, is there a way out of addiction?
Yeah.
You know? And we're happy to say yes.
Yes, so let's talk to the professor in you first, shall we?
There is hope in recovery. I mean, there's been a lot of studies done over the years. One of the biggest studies that has ever been done on addiction recovery found that we can look at people after a year and we can say, okay, they break down into three groups.
Mm-hmm.
One group who are just the same, one group who have improved, and another group who have recovered.
Mm.
And if we continue to follow these groups, the people who are in the recovered group, the longer they're in that recovered group, the more likely they are the following year and the year after that and the year after that. So the longer they are sober, the longer they tend to stay sober.
Okay.
You know, the people who are in the sort of, improved group, a lot of them move into the recovered group. So slowly but surely, about 66% of people who have addiction problems improve.
Okay.
You know,
really
either drink much less with less consequences, or they stop drinking altogether.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
the other thing is, and I mean, it's a fairly staggering statistic, but there's about 3 million people in the UK alone who are in recovery. About 3 million, so.
And that's in those two groups that they're either improving, heading towards not drinking at all.
Recovery.
In recovery.
Yep. Okay. So some of them are in and out of recovery, but most of them will be in recovery. There's a big sort of movement called Faces and Voices of Recovery, and that Faces and Voices of Recovery have a big sort of like a pride march every year, and it moves around different cities. And the last one had about 5,000 people at it, and that's only people who are willing to go out on the streets and say, "Yeah, I'm recovered." So yeah, it is becoming quite a big movement. People are taking pride in their recovery, and so they should. So they should. Yeah.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. How many of them do that by themselves without any help?
That's less so. When you start to look at the people who are in recovery, about 50% go through formal treatment. About 30% to 33% do it through mutual help groups. Mutual help groups like AA, Smart Recovery, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I know you tell me a funny story, but it really represents that change can happen in really odd ways. And you talk about this man when you were working in this recovery place in Glasgow that went in and out. Do you remember that story?
Oh, yeah. I'd forgotten about that story. Yeah, I was working in alcohol rehab in Glasgow. And I used to tell the students this because it illustrated a point, and it illustrated a number of points. But one of the things it was that this guy came in on almost an annual basis, and he would come in and he would have all his bills that the welfare had to pay for him. He would get dried out, and off he would go. And then about a year later, back he'd come, and you could almost set your clock by him, and then he didn't come. What's that? What's happened here? And a few months later, he did. He came in, he was well dressed, looked really, really well. And he said, what happened? because we had been treating him all this time, giving him the best possible treatment. And I said, what happened to you? And he says, well, just as I was going out, the receptionist called me back and said, see you, get a fucking grip. He says, and I thought, yeah, I think I'd better. And we just sort of went, that's the treatment that's needed.
Yes, you need to actually sit your drinker down and say, get a grip.
So I used to say this to students, and they'd say, well, what made this guy change? Was it just that particular statement? Or was it the accumulation of all the treatment that had gone up to then?
And what was the answer to that?
It's the accumulation. Sometimes there's just the old saying, the straw that breaks the camel's back. It was the right thing at the right time. He was receptive.
And what interests me in that story, if a brick wall, represents, recovery, there was no sign of any dismantling of that brick wall at all until one day it fell down.
Yeah.
And that shows that actually the roots of the brick wall perhaps were getting undermined more and more and more.
Very
and one
often,
comment, it caved in.
Yeah, very often that's what happens. The seemingly... It takes sometimes years for something to happen suddenly.
Yeah, suddenly can be a long time coming.
Yeah.
Somebody said, yeah.
And you can put as I said with that guy, you put all this treatment into him, and then just something happened. Something happened. Yeah, and that happens quite often. That happens quite often. That people, I can't get it. Oh, there it is. And that's it.
One thing we can say for certain, that one of the things that will erode your hope more than anything is disappointment.
Yeah.
Really, it was, I think for me, the disappointment when there'd been evidence of change, maybe for quite a while, when my partner had said, I'm really going to do it this time, and kind of went out somewhere or met someone and really felt as if he was going to go for it. And then he didn't. And that sick and awful feeling. And at that point, I mean, even listening to a podcast like this is really important because you feel as if hope drains away sometimes on a daily basis, I feel, when you live with a drinker.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your story because it is so filled with hope. Mine is different.
Yeah.
Because my husband didn't give up drinking until he was diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah.
And for the last year of his life, he couldn't keep drink down. And so he actually, this bravery that he'd never shown before, he showed. Sadly, he died of cancer. But before that, there were a lot of really hopeful things with the management of what he did. Gradually, we all worked as a family to contain.
Yeah.
And in the end, though he would have his binges, he would take himself away up into his bedroom, which used to took years to bring that to happen. But in the end, he did. And so the household learned, almost as if he was an island and we just flowed like a river around him and carried on life semi-normally. So there were a lot of improvements in my situation, although they weren't, like you, complete.
Some of that experience we've distilled into bottled up.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that even if you don't get sort of full recovery, then what you can do is you can ameliorate some of the consequences. You can reduce them so that, as you say, life sort of flows around the drinker rather than being disrupted by it all the time. Yeah, there's a couple of people I'd like to talk about, and I think what some of these people did is they gave me a different understanding of addiction. And the first one I would like to talk about is a guy called Paddy Mullen. He was a psychiatrist, and that psychiatrist was the guy who dried me out, told me that I had brain damage, etc. He also told me that I could actually be a force in the addiction field.
But he actually said that when you were still drinking?
He actually said that,
okay,
yes. I wasn't drinking at the time. He was treating me for it, which was interesting. But anyway, I was in this psychiatric ward, and there was all these other people there getting dried out as well. And we'd been there for a wee while, and they were being discharged, and they were talking about the party that we were going to have when we went out. We're all going to go to the pub and we're all going to get slaughtered, and I thought, why? Because I really didn't want to drink anymore. And I was sitting with Paddy Mullen, and I said to him, why do you bother? Why do you bring these people in here to dry them out? You're wasting resources. And he looked at me and he said, one day they'll want to get sober. He says, and I want to make sure they're alive to get that sober.
Uh-huh.
And I just thought, wow, never really thought about it that way, you know? And it was just, I mean, what the NHS bosses thought of his strategy is another matter, but I just thought, yeah, that's fantastic.
It's an attitude of heart, isn't it?
It was
really?
an attitude of heart. And I had great respect for this man, great respect for him. Another friend of mine was a friend, Michael, and he was a member of AA, and he used to go round to this guy's door every week and tap on his door. And he would just say the same thing, are you ready yet? You know, no, I'm not ready yet. And off he would go. Okay, see you next week. And he kept doing that. He kept doing that, you know. And eventually, one day, he said, yeah, okay. And away they went. So it is that persistence. And this is the hope. It didn't give up. And the last story I want to tell you is it was just after I had got sober, and I had a sponsor from Alcoholics Anonymous who was an ex-sergeant major in the army. It was just what I needed at that time. He just offered me about, I didn't have to think. So he told me, we're going to see this 12-step. So the 12-step was somebody who had called for help and wanted somebody to come and talk to him.
Okay, so the 12-step was just a title for this particular person.
It's the 12th step, you know, that you get, you know, continue to...
sort of an outreach to
basically.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he said, right, 8 o'clock in the morning, we're going to be there. The only thing we didn't do was do the SES bit and swing through the window. I mean, I thought, for goodness sake, what's this? And we sat down, and his girlfriend was there. I was in the kitchen with his girlfriend. He was in the lounge, and then we swapped over. And then eventually, this guy just got fed up. And he went into his cupboard, and he took about a bottle of fortified wine, stuck it in the table with 4 glasses, and said, right, let's have a drink. And we just got up and left. So we're walking away, and I was fairly new, sober, and I'm good. And I'm moaning, what was all that about? That was a real waste of time. And he said to me, he says, sometimes you are called to sow the seed, and sometimes you're called to reap the harvest.
Yeah.
And I thought, what a load of bull that is. And I was really grumbled. Yeah, I happened to get up at that time in the morning for a start. A couple of years later, I was in a meeting, and this guy walked in. And he was quite well dressed, and he came up to me and he said, do you remember me? And I said, nope, not a clue. Who are you? And he said, you remember that time you came to our door at 8 o'clock in the morning? He says, well, I've been sober for 6 months. He says, but I never forgot that. And I thought, wow. So I had to then go and apologise to John. But that was the thing. You know, sometimes the seed is planted. You know, sometimes it takes a wee while. And that guy we were talking about, you know, in the rehab, you know, when was that seed planted? Was it with the receptionist, or was it back in one of the meetings? I don't know. But sometimes we don't know when it's planted. What happens.
And if you live with a drinker and you put the seeds in, and we're going to show you how to do those seeds and what rocks not to come near, but also the seeds that you plant within your own life, you know, learning to take care of yourself, which we're obviously going to talk about. That's all of this is seeds of recovery, because you can recover even if you can't get your drinker to recover, because both of us need recovery. The person who lives with the drinker and the drinker, without a shadow of doubt.
Recovery is a family thing. Yeah. It's not just you don't recover in isolation.
No, absolutely not. We're going to take a break now, so we'll be back in a minute. Okay, so let's talk about your testimony.
Yeah.
Okay.
Where would you like to start?
Well, I think you've already mentioned that you were a charge nurse in a mental health facility, weren't you?
I was, yes.
And you had the keys to the drug cupboard.
I did, and I treated it a bit like a pick and mix.
Yeah.
You know, I thought, oh, there's a nice new antipsychotic. I'll have some of that. You know, and that's what I did. when I wasn't drinking, I had, I would just take all these different pills, the Valium, the Librium, as I say, the antipsychotics, the anxiolytics, the antidepressants, and I had cocktails, and that was okay. But this time I had been away, I'd been out of it for about 2 months. I was on this bender. It was the last bender ever.
Okay.
And
were you trying to work through that?
No, I didn't work through it at all. Okay. But what happened was that the hospital phoned me up and said, "Where are you? Are you coming back?" And I said, "Okay, I'll be in today," which was crazy. Yeah. It's absolutely mad, because I was in a dreadful state, and that state got dreadfuler as I went in. Anyway, I arrived in the hospital, took over, sat down, got the keys, and then the nursing officer came round, just as they did, doing the rounds, checking out everything's okay in all the wards. And he saw me and he just went, "Oh dear." And he got on the phone and he phoned up and said, "This guy needs to get off the ward." Because by this time I was getting into the DTs. It's the delirium tremens, which is the extreme end of withdrawal. I was shaking, sweating, hallucinating. It was a dreadful, dreadful state. So they came and they relieved me from the ward, and I was not very happy about that because, as I said, I had the keys to the drug cupboard, so I could self-medicate. And they took me up to the head of the hospital's office and sat me down there, and I was just sitting, head down, and really sort of in a bad way. And I said to the head of the hospital, I said, "I'm just a hopeless case." And he said, "You may well be." He says, "But you're not a lost cause." Now, it's incredible because I was in such a bad way, but I still remember those words. It was as if taking a scalpel and just opened my head and put these words in. And it was like a light coming on there.
If ever there was a message of hope,
that was it.
That sentence gave you hope in a hopeless situation. So
the psychiatrist, the head psychiatrist who all of our hospitals said, he said, "I would admit," he said, "but you work here and it's not a good idea." So it was him that sent me to Paddymullen and at the other side of the Glasgow.
And you drove in a terrible state in a car.
I was in a dreadful, dreadful state. Now, how I didn't smash my car, I don't know. But the first thing that they did was they just grabbed me, took the keys off me and sedated me and put me out, And then I started to get sober. But something changed. Something changed in me. And this was the kind of suddenly, after all these years, suddenly.
How old were you?
I was 34.
And how long have you been drinking?
I'd been drinking since I was 16. Yeah.
And you'd had your first marriage, which had finished?
My first marriage, she left because she just couldn't cope any longer, And when she left, I remember her words. I've got lots of words in my life, and I remember her words, and hers were, "I don't love you anymore. I don't like you, and I'm leaving before I hate you." And I thought, it's a bit harsh. And she went out one door and I went out the other. And I thought, yes, now I can drink like a gentleman. And as I've said before, I did for at least half an hour. And then I went on this mighty bender. I had no one left to blame anymore. And then I got sober, went to AA, and then I got drunk again. And then, and this was the catalogue. This was what happened. I didn't get sober immediately. It took me a wee while.
So that's really important. So, so again, the disappointment. If you go to AA, if your partner goes to AA, or your child, or your parent, I mean, obviously, there's other relationships where the drinker is involved, and they're there for a bit, and they come back. Is that fairly normal to come and go a bit at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, they reckon anything from 3 to 7 attempts can be. It's fairly normal. I mean, I eventually got a year sober, and I had been in this group, and an AA group, and the members of that group said, "We'd like you to come and celebrate your birthday at our meeting." And I said, "Is that because I'm such a good example?" And he said, "No, it's because if you can get it, anybody can get it." And I thought, I'm not sure if that was a compliment. So that was what happened. And that was true. If I could have got it, anybody could get it. And so I went and I did my 12. It took me a long time to actually settle into it. That first year was really quite difficult for me, I have to say. The first couple of months, it was okay because I'd been used to being sober for a couple of months. But what used to happen to me was I would sort of go through this bad period where physically and mentally I wasn't very well, because of the withdrawals from alcohol. Then it would be okay. Then it would be sort of, hey, you should have done this years ago. And then it would be clapping myself in the back because, and then I'd go, hey, what's not the problem? I know what to do now. One drink wouldn't matter. One drink wouldn't matter. Because I know what to do. I'm all right now. And of course, as soon as I took one drink, that was it. I was off and I was running. But when I eventually got to the end of that year, it was such a relief. Such a relief. Because now I was sober, and I probably going to stay sober now.
And you could look at yourself in the mirror and see somebody staring back this time that you were beginning to respect.
That took a wee while.
Yeah.
You've got to remember, when I got sober, my wife had left. I was living alone. I had to sell the house because there were lots and lots of debts. And also, we were not going to get back together again. I realised that she'd already found somebody else. And, and good luck to her. That hurt. And it was, I thought it was good for her. And so eventually sold the house and then had to move in with my mother. And I went from what I thought was a reasonably responsible man to short trousers overnight, and there's back in my mother's house, and this is hopeless, this. And I was sitting in the back doorstep, and I still smoked at that time. I was sitting there just sort of feeling a bit sorry for myself. And then this thought came into my head. It must have been a stray thought. It must have been meant for somebody else because I'd never experienced it before. And it was a thought that just came through, and it was so poignant. And it was, I wouldn't mind having me as a friend. Where did that come from?
Yeah.
And somebody who had suffered so much from low self-esteem, to have that thought, it was just, I thought, wow. And that was really the beginnings of recovery. Because that's what recovery is all about. Recovery is not just about stopping drinking. Recovery is about recovering yourself. It's about recovering your personality. It's about becoming somebody.
Yeah.
And my recovery, I'm not boasting when I say it, but my recovery is actually rather remarkable. Because I used to sit in pubs and say, see, tomorrow I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. I'm going to climb the mountains in Scotland. I'm going to go and scuba dive. I'm going to sail around the Greek islands.
And you never did until.
But it was always tomorrow because, you see, I'm drinking today, I'm busy. And since that time, yes, I have climbed the mountains in Scotland. I have scuba dived all around the world. I have sailed around the Greek islands. I've done all of that. But also, one of the things that I was really kind of bothered about was the fact that I left school with practically no qualifications at all. I was just rebel without a brain at school. I got thrown out of all the classes except religious education, which was compulsory. Not because I was dreadful. I was just a nuisance. I was a nuisance, the smart mouth, and I used to, the class clown, and, so I left school with practically nothing at all, but I always knew I had a brain. So I decided I went back to education. I went back to the Open University, and I got an honours degree in psychology. And then one of my tutors said, do you fancy doing a wee bit of research? And at Glasgow University. And I said, oh, yeah, okay. And so I did that, and I got a fellowship from the Scottish office, and which is there's not very many of them. So then I got a doctorate, and then I started to do serious research. I became a research fellow at the Glasgow University, and then I became a lecturer. And so it went. And I wrote a lot of papers on. But the funny thing was, I did not want to do my research on addiction. I thought, no, I've done enough research in addiction in my life. I don't want to do any more. It's had such a hold. But every time I tried to walk away from it, the door's shut. And every time I went back, the doors opened. That I went for a fellowship from the Scottish office to do something on nursing, and they said no. And I went for addiction, and they went, yes, come in. And they said they had 4 fellowships, and mine was awarded first because it was addiction. Not because it was addiction, but because they liked what I was doing. And then when I went to Paisley University, as it was at that time, it's now the University of the West of Scotland, they gave me tenure. Doors just opened. I got grants. I got all sorts. I went all around the world sort of lecturing. So that's what happened to me.
Yeah. Somebody quipped, which I think is really very astute and very true, that you went from a drunk to a doctor in a decade.
Almost exactly. It was almost exactly 10 years when I got my doctorate. Yeah.
Which is an amazing story. Thank you so much for sharing it.
But all I would like to say is, yes, it is an amazing story. It's an amazing story because it's my story, but it's an amazing story anyway. But it's also, there's so many other people who have done similar things. The number of people who are wandering about now, who are in very high positions, who are recovering. And it's just amazing. So that's my story. Yeah.
And I have to say, and they all lived happily ever after. But if you're a partner of a drinker, what we're talking about then is that the journey is beginning in recovery. And what will happen if you, because I don't take away from your story, which is amazing, but I'm here as the problem drinker's partner.
Yeah.
And so I would have been very suspicious. And we will talk about this in recovery, when we do one on recovery. I would have been absolutely amazed and very suspicious all at the same time. And everything in my heart would be saying, you be careful here, you be careful here, you be careful here. And then when that began to fade, then my recovery then would have to begin. I would need to look at all my feelings and stuff. So a fantastic story of recovery, but for a couple, often the beginning, not the end of the narrative.
We will talk in one of these podcasts about recovery, but you're quite right. Just because I was recovering and I kind of knew I was going to stay sober, didn't mean to say that anybody else did. We celebrated my 4th year in sober, and my mother came to that celebration and she said, I think you're going to stay sober now, son. I said, it's been 40 years. Yes, I know. That was all she said. Yes, I know. So for that 4 years, she was sort of walking on.
And it's interesting because you almost hope comes in then with all of its regalia. And you tell it to sit in the corner for a bit because you cannot cope with that massive sense of hope. So the takeaways then on hope is, first of all, that there is some.
Oh, absolutely, there is hope. I think there's far more hope now than ever before. I think there's more organisations helping now. But yes, as I said right at the top of this podcast, there's 3 million people in recovery in the UK. That's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. And around the world, there's huge numbers. Some of them have been sober for many, many years.
And I talk about my clients. We just talk about an analogy called a city journey and a country journey. In our country, if you have a country journey, you can often see miles and miles ahead. You can get glimpses of where you're going. A city journey, you do not take your bearings from what's ahead of you because You might be coming up to the tip, but you go left and then you suddenly see a park. And recovery is very much like that.
Yeah.
The scenery of it changes all the time, and sometimes you might feel as if you're going back on yourself, and then you think, oh no, we're back on track. So recovery is not going straight up like a mountain. It's going up and down with valleys and high bits and low bits, and that's very, very normal for recovery, and therefore hope goes up and down pretty well the same sort of way.
It does, but don't lose it.
No.
Don't lose the hope, because there is always there's always these chances that something is going to change. And again, as we've said, it sometimes takes an awful long time for something to happen suddenly.
Yeah.
And the stories I was telling at the beginning of all the different people who are sort of, their whole premise was the hope that someday something will change.
Yeah.
Something will change.
And again, we can nurture hope in our relationships with our loved one. And again, we will talk about that as we go along.
Yeah.
I hope that has encouraged you. There is loads and loads of information on bottledup.com. So please check that out as well. Thank you for listening.